I bet when you hear about a princess, you will always think those Disney princesses. The history tells a very different version. Li Yulan discovered that she was pregnant, and no one knew what happened or who the father was. This child is not illegitimate. The child was chosen. Hi there, Ziola here. Welcome back to my channel. Just the other day, I was listening to the news and then they mentioned Iran. And very casually, my mom said, Iran is the ancient Persia, right? And I was like, huh? Wait, what? Iran is Persia? As in Persian rocks, Persian poetry, Persian prince from the story I grew up hearing? Well, apparently yes. So I had just been educated by my beloved mother. And I'm fairly certain I wasn't the first person to find this out at this late in life. And I'm pretty sure that I won't be the last. Well, there was something strange about that moment that I find out. A piece of history I thought belonged to a myth suddenly stepped into the present. So the news didn't change, but the meaning and the name did. Well, at least in my mind. And all at once, so many spots just began to connect to each other. And so many old stories began to make sense. So today, let's not focus too much on the politics or the conflicts. I wanted to go back, way back in Han Dynasty, when Persian culture first became known on this land. So over 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty, a man named Zhang Qian traveled west on a mission that would eventually open what we now call Silk Road. At the time, China referred to Persia as Anxi, which is actually the Parthian Empire. So people in ancient China already knew that there was a great civilization far to the west. They knew about the glassware, its horses, its merchants. They knew that there were another world out there. And with people who are willing to travel very, very far to trade. Silk, spices, and stories. These two civilizations found each other. During Tang Dynasty, Persian merchants brought glass. That might sound a little dramatic to us now, but at the time, Persian glassware was astonishing. And Chinese artisans were masters of ceramic and bronze, but the clarity of Persian glass felt almost magical. There are records describing how people were fascinated by the lights passed through it, transparent, luminous, almost unreal. And maybe that's why this story feels important to us now, because it reminds us that what exists today is not exactly the only version of who we have been. When we talk about ancient connection between China and Persia, we often imagine like silk, glass, trade routes, and ideas. But sometimes connections can come in a much heavier way, like through marriage. And in this story that we're going to talk about it today, a Chinese princess goes on a journey to marry in Persia. I bet when you hear about a princess, you will always think those Disney princesses, like singing and dancing around in their beautiful dresses, meeting the prince of their life, and traveling with those adorable animal sidekicks. Yeah, and you admire them, or maybe envy them. The history tells a very different version. So in time of war, princesses were often asked to belong to two countries instead of just the one that they were born. Political marriage were not rare in ancient world. For an emperor, sending a bride across the border are so often far easier than sending an army, right? I mean, it was considered to be a wise choice throughout thousands of years that a war could be ended with a marriage. But for the woman, at the center of the decision, it means leaving everything. Well, however, though, You will probably find this story a little out of the ordinary. So in Han Dynasty, Persia requested a marriage alliance with China. Historians estimate that the Han court sent out 13 princesses in diplomatic marriages. But here's something that I need to clarify, okay? Most of these princesses were not actually imperial daughters. They were usually members of the extended royal clan or sometimes palace maids that met certain criteria. So they would have been given a noble name, renamed and dressed in the ceremony, and sent away. In records tells that a palace maid named Li Yulan, and she was granted the title of princess and sent west as part of the Persian marriage alliance. And imagine what her life would have felt like. One day you were a palace attendant, and then the next you're a symbol of peace between empires. Your name changes, your identity changes, and your future is decided in a court meeting you didn't even attend. So we often talk about diplomacy in terms of strategy and power, but sometimes diplomacy has a phase and sometimes is very, very young. So before her departure, the Han court held a grand farewell banquet. And just as you can imagine, music filled the halls, wine floated, and the officials spoke of peace, alliance, and wisdom of diplomacy. From the outside, it must have been looking very glamorous, glorious, but inside, Li Yulan was very, very quiet. I mean, who would willingly leave home for a land she has never been, a language she doesn't even speak, or a future she didn't even choose? And yet, for the sake of what was called the greater good, she bowed, accepted the title, and prepared to leave. Her bridal procession was not small. Han generals and soldiers accompanied her. Persian envoys traveled alongside to serve as translators and guides. The journey from the Han capital to Persia was long. And they have to go through deserts and go over mountains. When the group reached the Pamir Plateau, or often called the roof of the world, the landscape was vast and severe. It did not feel peaceful. Without warning, bandits descended from the surrounding ridges. Steel flashes, horse reared, shouts echoed through the thin air of the mountain. And the escorting soldiers fought fiercely, but the terrain just worked against them. To protect the princess, the guards made a swift decision. They led her up to a steep, isolated peak, a jagged outcrop rising sharply from the earth. A cliff surrounded all the sides. Only a single narrow path led upward. It was meant to be defensible, but that path was soon blocked as well. And to protect Li Yulan, the commanding general decided to move her to a nearby mountain peak until the danger passed. The group eventually regrouped, and the journey west did not end there. But something else happened, something that no one had prepared for. Li Yulan discovered that she was pregnant, and no one knew what happened or who the father was. But the news spread through the camp like wildfire, like shock, whispers, and fear. A diplomatic marriage depends on a symbol. A purebred was not just a personal matter, it was political currency. If word reached either side of the court, the princess was already carrying a child. A question would follow, and blame would follow, and punishment would follow as well. And in time like that, punishment rarely stopped with one person. In other words, the entire group are on stake facing a possible death penalty. And if either courts find out what happened, and then at that point, the princess's maid stepped in. And she did something both bold and strangely beautiful. She declared that the child was not the result of a scandal, but of divine will. She claimed that on the night before the pregnancy, a golden light had filled the princess's tent. It was the sun god, she said. In many regions along the western frontier, the sun was worshipped as powerful deity. So the light, she insisted, was not shame. It was a blessing. This child is not illegitimate. The child was chosen. It's fascinating how often in history when politics reach its limit, myth steps in and holds everything together. Well, just like that, a potential scandal became a miracle. And after long decision, the envoys from both sides reached an uneasy decision. And they will go neither west to Persia or east back to Chang'an. Not yet. They would remain where they are until the child was born. And so months later, Li Yulan gave birth to a son. And something shifted. She understood what everyone else already says but dare not to say. If they return to Han court, there will be questions. And if they continue to Persia, there will be questions as well. And in politics, questions can be more dangerous than swords. So she did something extraordinary. She stood before the divided escort. The Han soldiers, Persian envoys, attendants who had followed her across desert and mountains. And she proposed a plan that must have sounded impossible. She says that since this child had truly been sent by divine will, then perhaps that will should be honored. Since he had been born under the heaven sign, then he should one day be king. So instead of returning east to Chang'an or continue west to Persia, they would remain where they were and build a new beginning right there in the mountains. And so for a moment, there was silence. And then slowly, our heads began to nod. It's like, okay. Desperation can turn into courage when there are no other roads left. And so they began. The bridal procession became builders. The mountain peak became a foundation. They used stone from the cliffs and timber from the forest below to construct the fortified halls. And seeds brought from Han land were planted in these unfamiliar soil. A child who might have caused a diplomatic crisis became the center of this new beginning. It is strange to think about that between two great empires in a place meant only as a temporary refuge, a kingdom could be imagined into existence, not through war, but through survival. Over time, what began as a refuge became something more. On the vast, wind-swept heights of Pamir Plateau, a small but structured city-state slowly took shape. Stone walls rose against the mountain wind, and fields lined the slope in careful terraces. Caravans passing through began to notice it. According to later accounts and regional legends, this new kingdom was called Qiepantuo, known historically as Kingdom of Tashkurgan. Located what is now in Xinjiang province, it stood at a strategic crossroad of Pamir Plateau, a meeting point between Central Asia, the Tarim Basin, and northern India. But what fascinated me most was not the geography. It's the story people told about themselves. the legend said the kingdom was born from a Han princess and the sun god. Its people call themselves children of Han and heaven. It was the name that carried both identity and survival. On one hand, it honors the Han lineage of the princess, and on the other hand, it embraced the solar worship common in the Western regions. The historical records and the legends don't really tell us what she was like as a person. But after reading the story, I kept thinking, she must have been a very brave woman. Because when she chose to keep that child and bring him into the world, something shifted. She stopped being a chess piece in the political game of two empires. And for the first time, in her own way, she was choosing her life. History, of course, is silent about what really happening in her heart. But sometimes I wonder if there might have been a quiet and courageous love story somewhere lost in the middle of all that. One that the official records never captured, and that perhaps only Li Yulan and the maid who stood by her side ever truly know. You see, this princess on Pamir Plateau, whether remembered as a legend or part of the history, was not just a symbol of diplomacy. She was a woman navigating uncertainty and chose boldly for her life, just like the women that we see today, standing for dignity in their own way. Different centuries, different struggles, but the same courage. When my mom told me that Iran is Persia, something softened in me. A place that once felt distant suddenly carries stories I recognized. I remember that Persia once deeply inspired the Han culture or the Chinese culture with its glamorous merchants, fascinating legends and stories, and even a great faith that brings peace to the land. And that's why I decided to make this video. That in the midst of all the darkness, these little stories can be a little light, bringing some peace to the restless hearts. I'm Ziola. See you next time.